Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the Suibhne podcast. Today we are going to be doing the fourth episode of Rabbit Hole. I know that those two things are kind of like synonymous at this point. We haven't done any other shows, but we will do some eventually. Some is in the pipework, in the pipeline, whatever that expression is. And in continuing tradition of the show, I have to wait for the first 30 seconds to make sure that the audio is coming through. That sounds like it's coming through fine. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about something that has been bugging me for a long time. Militarism is something that has always kind of fascinated me. And militarism is something that is, for lack of a better term, being militaristic, in the least helpful definition of the Suibhne podcast. Now, we obviously know that militarism was this really destructive force that was one of the things that was responsible for the outbreak of the First World War and the Second World War after that. One of those things that is just generally both acknowledged for being extremely destructive and also somehow poorly understood. And one of the things that makes it fascinating to me is that it doesn't necessarily originate in the same place in different periods of time. It doesn't originate the same way in different places. And because this video that I'm doing on the Balkans, on Serbia, has had a lot of opportunities for me to be able to look into something called the military frontier. In the background there, I've got sort of a what you would consider like a sort of ring fort or a sort of classic castle. One of these things that you often see around Europe and Asia. There's sort of these things that are quite common sights, but that's just a little preview there for what we're going to be talking about today. So last week or the week before, we talked a lot about the Battle of Kosovo and how that ended up being this crazy defining moment in the history of the Serbs. And a lot of people point to this as like the origin of like Serbian militarism, and that they were among the first really militaristic societies. And I think that that's in one way true, but in the least helpful way possible, because the Balkans has kind of always been very militaristic. We talked a little bit about the collapse of the Roman Empire and how, running through the Balkan Peninsula is this mighty river called the Danube and a couple of like tributary rivers that go across it. So you got like the Sava and the Drava and the Great Morava River, those sort of rivers. There's these large, chunky rivers that go through the Balkans, and they functioned as this sort of barrier of sorts for the Roman Empire. That's just like a natural good thing to fortify yourself up against. Whenever you have a large, continuous or contiguous empire, you need to fortify your borders if you want that sort of thing to be maintained when you're creating a state, because having the borders is not only about protecting what, like foreign adversaries coming in, but also very important for trade. If you control a migratory route from one area to another, especially if it's like from one state and then a non-state outside of that, like the Roman Empire was. It was this like large, unified, and very centralized state. And then outside of Rome's borders were all these very non-state political alliances and tribes and that sort of thing. There were some, obviously, like state-like nations and that kind of thing, but the vast majority was sort of either nomadic or tribal or that sort of thing. And when those groups trade with the relative stability that is Rome, as people come through that border, that you can tax them or you can do a tariff on them, that kind of thing. And that's a big source of income for the Roman Empire in those days. Not only that, but it's also a great base to project power outside of your borders. So one of the things that made the Roman state so interesting was when they had, when they were engaging in their first sort of diplomatic efforts outside of their city and outside of Italy and so on and so forth. I call it diplomacy when perhaps I should be using the word conquest. But as they sort of, let's just say the proto-Roman Empire, this entity that sort of like was dipping its toes into getting outside of Italy's borders and getting its toes into the Mediterranean Sea and feeling the temperature and just feeling if it's warm and whether or not they can be bothered, really stripping down to their bathers and taking a nice little swim. They were just thinking to themselves, we need to see if the water's warm and see if we want to go there. The Alps for a long time were this like natural border. So the Alps you can see sort of here towards the northern part of Italy. The Alps were this like northern border for the Romans that protected them from a lot of what would otherwise be invading forces. You had the Celts, you had the Gauls, all these like different some other like Italic peoples that could very easily sort of invade this prosperous peninsula otherwise if the Alps weren't there. So the Alps represented this like big logistical challenge for any invading army that wants to come from the middle of Europe down to Italy, and it continues to be to this day. It's like, we have modern day armies and that sort of thing, but it's still very difficult to move an army across the Alps in any way. As Hannibal well knows, Hannibal, the famous Carthaginian general who brought Rome to its knees, famously climbing the Alps with elephants, in no fear at all of cold or frostbite or anything like that. To his own detriment, of course, because he would eventually lose, or so I'm told. I'm not a historian. Anyway, so borders are these like kind of things that, we find ourselves very difficult to separate ourselves from because we live in nation states with very strict borders. We've developed this system over the past few centuries whereby you get a passport and you need to go to the border and you need to go get your little passport stamped. And then when you got your little passport stamped, then you can come into the country. And isn't that nice? And maybe you'll have to pay some money along the way too, just for the administrative costs and that sort of thing. And it's sort of this thing that we tell ourselves has always existed. And in many ways it has, and in many ways it hasn't. Because, when you have a large, massive state like something like Rome, you're never really going to be able to police the whole thing. You're never really going to be able to say, okay, we're going to erect a large Trump-style wall or palisades, I'm sure the Romans would have called them, and they would have said, let's make a big wall and we'll police the whole thing. Essentially impossible, right? With the manpower and the cost, like it's just essentially impossible. And one of the things that made that a challenge was the sheer distances, and if you can make things a little bit easier for yourself by anchoring your borders against natural geographic features like the Alps or like the Danube or these like long mighty flowing rivers, that's a lot easier because not everybody can afford to build a pontoon bridge over a river or buy an elephant to bring over a Hannibal. Those things are expensive. Boats are expensive, pontoons, boats are expensive, and elephants are expensive, Hannibals are expensive. You can't just pick up a Hannibal lying around. Those things are expensive. They're essentially one of a kind. You can't just find a Hannibal every time you want to invade Rome. You got to take what you can with the Hannibal and use it wisely. Anyway, so borders. I am very fascinated by these things called the military frontiers that were constructed mainly by the Holy Roman Empire, and more specifically, the Austrian part of the Holy Roman Empire. The Austrian House of Habsburg got very powerful during the Middle Ages. They sort of married and bought and sold estates and became very powerful. And they once ruled like a fifth or something of the European continent. They had members of their dynasty were in like Spain and Italy and Germany and all these like crazy far off flung places were ruled once by this large extended family of the Habsburgs. And the Habsburgs were sort of at this like frontier part of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is sort of this sort of middle, like yellow section. I apologize once again for the lack of labels on these maps. I haven't gotten around to doing them yet. Don't pester me. Anyway, there is this orange section is sort of the core parts of what eventually became the Habsburg realm. You've sort of got here, you've got like the crown of Bohemia and Silesia up here, and then this big chunk here is sort of their base of operations. It is the Austrian part of their realm, made up of these, I guess, counties, whatever their estates were called. You know, you've got like Lower Austria and Upper Austria and blah, blah, blah. This was their base of operations. And of course, like we looked at last week, we've got these Turks incoming. These Turks are here shown in red. The Turks are invading Europe. And this represents not just like a straight up like military conquest, it's also a conquest of culture and religion. You know, it's this like weird symbolic power play. It's a sort of a contest of arms and of spirituality and about who's the real successor of Rome. Because one of these crazy things that I keep coming back to, which I always find so hilarious, is that the Ottoman Empire did indeed see themselves as the legit successors of Rome. When they broke through the walls of Constantinople and brought the city to its knees, they didn't say, well, we've destroyed the Roman Empire. Aren't we so good? We've destroyed it and pat ourselves on the back. No, they thought they were the Roman Empire. There was nothing in their mind that separated them from claiming any Roman authority. Hello, Dev. Dev says, damn, only one watching. Hell yeah. Yeah, this is the ground floor of the podcast. I haven't done a proper announcement. You know, you're getting this like sneak peek of the podcast before it really goes live. I'm hoping to have a few of these episodes under my belt once I've got a few under my belt. I'm going to do a proper announcement and everybody will be able to come and watch to their heart's content. But people like you were in on the ground floor. And for that you deserve a special prize. Check your DMs. No, not really. So there is a invasion from the European perspective, from the Christian perspective of the Austrians and the Holy Roman Emperors. This, from their perspective, a large deluge of nomadic hordes of Turks. These Turks are incoming and they're gonna take all our jobs. That kind of thing. You know, it was a mass hysteria of utmost political, economic, military, and religious importance. It was just you know, it was the apocalyptic event of the time. And there was these two large kingdoms sort of side by side here. You had the Hungarian kingdom, this large Christianized kingdom that itself has its origins in nomadic tribesmen who had migrated in from the steppes and eventually settled down. And down here is the Croatian kingdom. And the two dynasties between these two, like the Croatian and the Hungarian kingdoms, are very, very intertwined by the middle of the Middle Ages. And they're sort of really happy with one another. You know, they've got a good marriage. They're loving life. They don't have too many Habsburgs running around. It's all great, They've kept themselves strong by this strong military tradition. They're really good at being a plundering Christian kingdom right at the heart of Central or Central Eastern Europe. They're plundering, they're taking names, they're having a grand old time, and they're intertwining themselves quite heavily with the Croats, the Croatian kingdom that sort of has its... these two states become very intertwined aristocratically. The lords are marrying each other, that kind of thing. And unfortunately, when the Turks conquer the Balkans, they drive these dynasties basically to extinction, and all the lords run off into the Holy Roman Empire, and they say, "Oh, please help us. We'll do anything." And the Habsburgs said, "Oh, sure, we can take that off your hands." So they eventually end up absorbing these parts of the former Croatian kingdom and the former Hungarian kingdom. There's not much left. And they enter into this sort of peace negotiation with the Turks. The Habsburgs and the Turks meet together, and they shake each other's hands, and they say, "Good day to you, sir," or however you say that in Turkish or German. And they say, "Okay, we're going to agree that this is going to be our border." This is the very beginnings of what would eventually become the Habsburg frontiers. So I'm just going to change it to this one because a little bit of continuity in terms of colors. Okay, so it basically begins with these two sections right here. This is the former Croatian kingdom, and the Turks have invaded. They've been burning down villages. They've been destroying churches. They've been destroying monasteries. And a bunch of the people that live over here in the red bit decide that they're going to migrate. So they migrate as far away as they can, and they get into this area here. And the Habsburg emperor at the time, I can't remember exactly which one he was. Maybe he was Leopold, or maybe he was Ferdinand. It was probably Ferdinand. And Ferdinand said, what we're going to do is we're going to make these areas are going to be highly militarized. We're going to station all our troops. So they send all their troops down here. And they divide the Croatian kingdom into two. One of them is centered on Karlovac, which is... I can't remember the German name for it. But Karlovac and Varagin, these are going to be the two administrative sections of what will be the first parts of the Habsburg military frontier. And eventually the system works quite well, because now you've got armies sitting in this area, and they're stationed there, and they're living there, and they get granted these like privileges and exemptions from taxes, and they get other privileges like you can keep whatever religion you want. This is a time when there's like big conflicts between religious groups. There's like the Orthodox and the Catholic obviously been having a go at each other for who knows bloody how long at this stage. And the Protestant Reformation is like just beginning to heat up too. And the tolerance for different people's religions, let's just say that was something new. That was something that was still being worked on. They're still drafting the first manuscripts. They haven't handed in their work yet. They're still doing their homework, trying to figure out how to live in peace when bloody Jim over there is a Orthodox and I'm over here as a Protestant. It's a hell of a time. They're really struggling with the whole thing. So religious toleration, big upside. That attracts a lot of people, regardless of their religion, to come and settle in Karlovac, in this military frontier in what is Croatia and Slavonia. And that's sort of the two divisions that happen there. And then eventually you have the Drava front and the Danube front and the mining front, and then Upper Hungary, as you can see plainly on the screen. If you're listening to the audio version of this podcast, just sort of imagine in your head like a wooden stake in the ground with a sign on top that says no Turks allowed. This is ours. You stay over there. bad Turks, you stay over there. That's essentially the visual representation of what's happening on screen. I really think you should watch the video version. Like, what do you would expect me to like explain this to you the whole time about wooden stakes? I mean, come on, really, it's ridiculous. Anyway, so they get sort of settled in this military frontier, and eventually, what happens is you all the great military minds, all of the best engineers and builders, they come to the court of King Emperor Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, or whatever the heck his title was at the time. And they say to him, look, this is great. Like, we've halted the Turks, but our armies are still getting like destroyed in the field if we're actually engaging with them. It's really great for like reconnaissance missions, and we can like plunge deep into their territory and burn down a couple of their villages and maybe return, and that's great because we're harming the Turks economically. And the problem is like it's like really expensive, and all these like other estates from the richer parts of the Holy Roman Empire, they're having to pay for this whole thing. You know, they don't have a Mexico to pay for it. They have to pay for it. So they stick all their money that they can afford into a big chest, and then they go and deliver the chest of money to all the soldiers living over there. It's a nightmare. You know, you gotta get an ox cart to carry all the money. It's ridiculous. What we should do instead, said the engineers, is make a bunch of fortified towns. And the Emperor was like, okay, what's a fortified town? Like, I've never heard of this before. The old way of doing fortified towns is what we had on screen just a second ago. Not that one. That's a spoiler. So the old way of doing fortified towns is essentially these like medieval style castles. They got the big towers, you got walls joining them, and maybe you have like a sort of central citadel. Maybe it's like a secondary part of the castle that's like extra fortified, and that's where you keep all the good stuff. That's where you keep all the good chests of money and the Krispy Kreme donuts and whatever it is else that you're trying to save. And you put that in the citadel, and maybe you can just fire your arrows down at the enemy if they're trying to attack, and it'll all be grand. You know, this is the old way of doing it. And then eventually sort of towns and villages sort of either prop up inside them, or they fill up the outskirts, like they become dependent on the economy of that local castle or fortified town. And that's essentially the old way of doing that. The problem is it doesn't do very well against gunpowder, and the Turks were like all into gunpowder. It was like their favorite thing. They were super duper into this hot new technology. They're putting big metal balls into big metal cylinders, and they're putting a bunch of gunpowder in there, and they're lighting it, and they're blowing shit up. It's crazy. And these castles don't do very well against gunpowder. They don't do very well against these big, new, fancy cannons. So you've got a problem on your hands. So these Italian engineers at this time are working on this brand new thing. They're calling it a star fort. And the star forts are essentially these big... It's essentially, you know, you can pretty much well imagine what a star fort is. I've got an image of it here somewhere. Oh, look at that seamless transition. So this is a star fort. This is like a very, very good version of what it eventually ends up becoming. This is, I think, this Geneva. So this is like a famous plan of what eventually became Geneva. All these like little spiky bits on the outside, those are called bastions, and they've got, you know, you might have like an old medieval wall like we were looking at before, but this way you can build little spiky things, and they can be at a much steeper gradient, which is not only hard for soldiers to run up without getting shot, but also helps deflect cannonball fire, which is great because, you know, one of the things that these soldiers hated more than anything was getting hit with a cannonball. So they said, this is going to improve things a lot more. We're going to be hit by far fewer cannonballs, it's gonna be great, and you should enlist in the army because you can keep whatever religion you are, and you can come and live in a star fort, and you don't have to get hit in the head with cannonballs. Like, I don't know about you, but that's the dream. I mean, what else? What else could you want in life? And I think this is such a beautiful fort, by the way. Like, gosh, what a gorgeous one. It's very pleasing to the eye. And one of the funny things is, like, Star Fort's become this like weird arms race. Of course, everything is an arms race, and but this was like especially arms racy because they used to have these like competitions between all these engineers in like different scientific what do you call them, like when people get together to do science. I can't think of the word right now, but when people would come together for these like exhibitions and that sort of thing, that you would have these engineers coming with their like brand new design for a star fort and brand new like bastion forts and that kind of thing. And people started competing with one another with who could make the best star fort, which I think is quite funny. And these start to dominate the old military frontier. So I also have a drawing here with this is sort of essentially like a generic looking star fort. I sort of modeled this on the niche fortress, just because I mean, obviously at the time it wasn't part of the Habsburg domains, but it was just like a good indication of one of the star forts that, or a bastion fort that the Ottomans made in response. Everyone was doing star forts or bastion forts or whatever the heck. It was like the hot new thing, you know. It's the brand new thing. In addition to, of course, the cannons. You know, they're star forts and cannons. They go hand in hand in many ways. A marriage made in, well, not heaven, but you know, whatever version of that. So this is sort of how these military frontiers originate, and eventually these military frontiers are like chock full of star forts, and they're chock full of these soldiers, these military frontiersmen. And over time, the king sort of realizes, okay, this is working out really well. We're gonna codify these privileges that you get, and we're gonna make this into sort of like a centralized structure and make it much more formalized. So this works pretty well, and you get all these people migrating over into the Habsburg realms. We talked about this a bit last week and the week before, and the core of the idea is that you're going to basically give up whatever it is that you're leaving, and you're going to fight for the emperor. You're going to fight to maintain your lands, and in return you could live off that land, and you could elect your own captain and that kind of thing. So it's a bit of give, bit of take. I still think if you're fighting on behalf of an emperor, you're probably still getting the raw end of the deal. But what's the alternative, you know? So eventually the Habsburgs start winning the war, and they push the border further and further south as the centuries go on. So you've got this big, long border, and the border changes, and they move people around. And the sections of the border, you know, they're filled to the brim with all these different people. You've got Croats, you've got Dalmatians, you've got Bosniaks, or what they didn't call them Bosniaks at the time, but people who were from the Bosnian kingdom. A lot of them don't really like, if we were using like a modern term to describe them, so they weren't Catholic and they weren't Orthodox. They sort of fit somewhere in between. So you have this big Catholic political entity on the left or the west, which is Croatia and Slavonia and that sort of area, and then on the other far end you have Serbia, or what was originally Serbia, and then in between them is Bosnia. And Bosnia didn't really lean one way or the other on the Catholic Orthodox feud. They were a bit hipsterish, and they decided that they wanted to be part of a different church called the Bosnian Church. And there's like a lot of theories as to what the Bosnian Church was and what kind of practices they were doing. The simple explanation for this stuff is probably that during this time, the Balkans is very mountainous, and when Christianity is spreading through these areas, it never quite takes a full hold the way it is able to in sort of non-mountainous areas. These are depopulated lands that are settled by newcomers, and the old comers are fleeing to the hills, and it's not the best circumstances for the institutions of either side of the church to get involved in. And what that means is that a lot of these independent Christian communities in the Balkans develop very independently, and they're preserving things that the proto-Orthodox churches and the proto-Catholic churches are describing or deciding are heresies. So they're preserving these heresies and heretical practices and liturgies and things like that. We can't like grasp a full understanding of what the Bosnian Church was, like what kinds of heresies they were involved in, but it's almost certainly wasn't as big a deal as they would have made out, the other religious leaders would have made it out to be. A lot of those religious leaders had a vested interest in containing the spread of the Bosnian Church and that sort of thing. So when the Turks come along, they sort of see this like marginalized group in the Bosnian Church, and they say, we're gonna allow you to raise in our society. We're gonna allow you to raise through the ranks in our society. You can have a lot of privileges if you convert to Islam. And this call goes out to basically everyone that they conquered, and converting to Islam is like a surefire way to get yourself into the privileged car seat and get taken for a ride up into the administration system of the Ottoman Empire. And because the members of the Bosnian Church had been like persecuted for so long, this was like an easy sell for them. They were sort of taken under the wing of the Ottomans and said, we're going to be much more likely to succeed if we convert to Islam. And so that happens over time. And in the greatest numbers in Bosnia, obviously Serbs did too, and Croats did too, but it happened in the largest numbers by far in what is Bosnia. So, along comes these. So yeah, so those are what eventually become Bosniaks. That's the designation for that word there. The Turks are doing a lot of demographic changes in the areas that they conquer. It's not helpful to have populations of people that are like not willing to submit to you. So the villages that decide, okay, we're going to submit to the Ottomans, they get left alone. The ones that don't get burned down and cause a refugee flood. And all of these people flood into the Habsburg parts of the realm and primarily end up settling into these frontiers. This has such an incredible effect as the generations go down of birthing militarism. Whenever you look at the expansion of militarism and this like borderline obsession that people have in the early 20th century with militarism and like past glory, like we've always been like a warrior people. We have to conquer lest we be conquered. Those are the sort of philosophies that are spreading like wildfire throughout the early 20th century and late 19th century. And it's because, the evidence in many ways speaks for itself. It's like, well, we've been conquered, we've been subjugated, we're living under the yoke of the Ottoman Empire or whomever it happens to be. We clearly need to like break free. We clearly need to fight against these people and shed blood and all that kind of stuff. So many flags of countries, the color red features so prominently in the country flags of the nations today because that represents like fighting and blood spilled. We spilled the blood, and that's how we achieved our freedom, which is just like the saddest thing ever. That's the thing that you have to remember. It's just like a crazy obsession with like militarism and like remembering. Obviously, you want to have like reverence for the people who died and sacrificed themselves, but what happens in like the late 19th and early 20th century is it becomes this obsession. Most infamously, probably in the Third Reich, in Nazi Germany. It's like militarism was like their thing. Like they loved their military history and that kind of thing. But a lot less is talked about the Balkans, unless it becomes like a meme. You know, we've got like this like image in our head of that's been sort of spread through popular culture of the militarized Balkans and how they all just want to like blow each other up for goodness knows what reason. And a lot of that traces its roots to these military frontiers. You've got intergenerational indoctrination into these military frontiers. Your entire economy and like economic life and your entire like purpose for the village that you settle in or the town that you settle in is to like defend against the Turks. So like even if you're not a soldier directly fighting in this war, you'll have relatives and family members and husbands and sons and that sort of thing involved in it, and you'll be supporting the war. You'll be stitching uniforms or whatever, or you'll be farming the land and the surplus land, the food would go to the army and that kind of thing. So this is an intense obsession that is like birthed from this intergenerational protection or fighting in this like protective defensive way, which in many ways becomes offensive more than anything as time goes on, because this is like I was saying with the Romans, this is like a great base of operations to plunge deeply into the Ottoman territory and nab some goodies, like nab some gold and silver and Krispy Kreme donuts and really make off with that. And that's like hurting the Ottoman economy, and that's like benefiting the Habsburg economy, and it helps it like thrive and continue to increase in power. This is all very par for the course with what is the origin of militarism. It's quite fascinating. And then over time, these borders get more and more like organized. You've got these little capitals that end up taking place. This is a long, extremely fortified part of the world at the time. As sort of the 1600s folds into the 1700s, and this is if you're looking into what is the consequences of militarism. The Serbian militarism in particular, is responsible for some of the most destructive things that have ever happened in our world. It is what caused World War I, and it is responsible in many ways for its contribution to the breaking up of Yugoslavia and that really, really intense, sad time in our species' history traces its roots to these military frontiers. In a lot of ways, this was like one of the few things that were granted. It was one of the few pieces of grace that were granted to the Serb people when they migrated into the Holy Roman Empire, into the Austrian Habsburg realm. Called the stream Marco, welcome, and Satiris, why stream so early? It's not early where I am. It's quite late. It's late on a Friday afternoon, so the video will be available to watch on demand. Because I am a generous content creator and I leave my stuff up for everyone. Anyway, so this military frontier forms the core part of what like becomes Vojvodina. If I sort of overlay like a modern map, this sort of top section here, this is all Vojvodina, and as you can see, this is like right in the middle of all these massive military districts. Before these military districts existed, this area was primarily inhabited by Hungarians or a people people very closely related to Hungarians. That changes as the Ottoman conquests happen. These areas become quite depopulated and then settled with other peoples, depending on the time or that sort of thing. Turks migrate in, and then when they conquer, the Turks migrate out, and they settle all of these Serbs in this area. And this is like the core focal point of Serb political expression within the Habsburg realms. This area, like Vojvoda, it means like captain, and that's the name given to by the soldiers of the military frontier. Sort of say, we're gonna elect our own leaders, and those leaders are gonna be called Vojvoda, which means like captain. So this whole area sort of gets called Vojvodina in common parlance. And this whole section above the Danube is a part that, were this not to have happened, the modern Serbian nation state wouldn't include that area. When the nation states that sort of arise in the 19th and 20th century, when they arise, these are essentially these like state building projects where they decide, I want to draw the biggest circle around the most of my people as I can, and exclude most of the people that aren't part of my state as I can. And in trying to do that, the Serbian state draws this big line around this area called Vojvodina. And of course, the Serbs weren't the only ones that inhabited that area. There were a lot of Romanians and Hungarians and Germans and Jews and Vlachs and all sorts of like different ethnic groups that lived in there. But it was primarily Orthodox Christian, and in a time when Orthodox meant Serb as much as it meant just which religion you follow, they drew a nice big circle around those people and included them in their state building project. And that's where the term Vojvodina comes from. I did a special bonus podcast for patrons as well as YouTube members, talking a little bit about the origins of these names in a little bit more detail. So if that sounds like your cup of mayonnaise, then please go and check that out over on the main channel's Patreon. So Vojvodina is this like center of political expression within the Serbian component of the empire. And of course, people knew that there were these differences in all of these South Slavic groups, especially in terms of religion. A lot of the times you hear people you hear records of complaints that people have for the other ethnic group. Right over here we have Vojvodina, but a lot of Serbs or Orthodox Christians migrated into these areas here in this part of the frontier. Some of them, they made up like the majority or close to the majority of the population. I'm pretty sure in like this area here, like Banal, like these two sections here, Banal, these areas were made up the majority, like more than half the population of these were Orthodox Christians, and some of them were Vlachs, but they end up being subsumed into the dominant language and culture, and eventually sort of just become Serbs in without splitting hairs. And this obviously becomes a problem over time when you trying to build a nation and you're trying to describe draw a line around the most relative people and people that are related to one another. You end up having to like make these decisions about who to exclude and who to include. And for the Serbian state building project, that was always focused on restoring people who had their origins in these migrations and who were Orthodox Christians. But the thing is, there were very few real differences in day-to-day life between a Catholic Croat, a Muslim Bosnian, and a Orthodox Serb. There was very little difference. They lived side by side. Their communities were interrelated. That kind of thing. There were conflicts. The conflicts that occur are always quite funny. They're always saying things like, I don't like, a Serb will say, I'd rather die than be under the command of a Croat. And those sort of things are like used by, they got propagated during the Yugoslav wars. They were pulled out as propaganda, saying like referencing long forgotten heroes and talking about like, oh, we need to take a page out of their book because clearly these people had their heads screwed on straight. No, these are very like propagandized statements. It's usually them complaining about when they're talking about like the Croat that they're complaining about, it's usually a captain. It's usually like, and they're objecting to have to like be ruled by a Catholic captain. They're not saying, oh, I'm racist or nationalist against Croats. Like racism and nationalism don't exist in the same way in those times that we think about them today. Nationalism is something that comes much later. So a lot of these things are propagandized like crazy in militarized societies because you've got both people sort of looking back on this extremely long heritage they have fighting against the Turks and now saying, okay, well, now I'm going to fight against you because you took away our freedoms and our rights and whatever have you. So these are the sort of things that militarism has its origins in. And I think that this is sort of one side of the coin, and we talked a little bit about this last week as well, about how the Balkans is sort of this like very mountainous place. It's an extremely mountainous area, and you've got this tradition that arises as the Turks come in. Whenever there's a massive invasion of Balkans, whether it's like the Slavs coming in to the Roman Empire, or it's the Turks coming into the Serbian kingdom and the Serbian Empire and that sort of thing, there's always these massive migrations that happen, and everybody else living there either assimilates or they flee up into the hills because these mountains are like really easy to defend. Stick yourself up on a mountain, make yourself a little community up there, and throw rocks down at the people trying to attack you. It's like a common thing that happens all over the Balkans, and this tradition continues throughout the centuries. It's actually quite fascinating. One of the sources that I was reading was talking about how when the Slavs entered the Roman Empire, it was obviously very like depopulated like crazy, and that's why the Slavs were doing their migrations in the first place. But obviously there were Romans still living there, and they fled to the hills. And one of the sources describes it as like a sea of Slavs dotted with islands of vlachs, and vlachs is just another word for Roman. So this like tradition of fleeing to the hills and then like throwing stones at whoever's invading you, it's a tale as old as time in the Balkans. And this is one of the things that happens with the Serbs too. They flee up into the hills, and they're eventually able to sort of eke out a living and an existence in a kind of banditry. And that banditry becomes this cultural expression of their like fight against the Turk, this caricature that they have in their mind of this like Turk who's like an invading barbarian infidel who's coming to, I don't know, steal your jobs or whatever. He wants your Krispy Kremes. And they're sort of getting really good at fighting the Turks. They're really good up in the hills, and they become haiduks. And haiduk is like it's this sort of Serbo-Croatian word meaning like bandit or freedom fighter or rapscallion. And they're these outlaw warriors who come and they throw stones at the Turks, and they steal from the rich and they give to themselves. And they get really good at it. And this is another part of this like origin of the militarist part of the Balkans. In many ways, it's the far more ancient part. If you think about like way before like any political state existed, like the geography of the land has been there for a lot longer than any state has. So this is something that would have had a massive effect on culture. And even if the peoples there died out due to war and famine or starvation or climate change or whatever it happens to be, then whoever's going to come along and take up that territory is going to absorb that they're going to have that cultural expression anew because the geography is what does it. It's the mountains that do it. It's really easy to run up a hill and throw stones at somebody at the bottom of the hill. So these haiduks, this has become like all across the Balkans. You get these freedom fighter haiduks, And Haiduks are not necessarily any sort of like one unified thing. They're all operating in different parts of the Balkans. They're Albanians and they're Serbs and they're Bosnians and they're Vlachs and they're Aromanians and they're Greeks. All these sort of people fleeing up into the hills and becoming Haiduks. And that is another origin of that militarism, because it's like looking back on these Haiduks when the Serbian Renaissance comes. It's like Marco says that Hajduk also means like raider. Uskok. So Uskok is like another word. It's like this like the origin of the word Uskok means like it's just these like bandits across the Danube, and it's more of like an exonym. They're saying these like Uskoks over the river. They're like fighters, Uskok, and like freedom fighter. It's also the other word is Chetnik. So like Chetnik, Uskok, Hajduk, these are all like related words, kind of describing like similar things or overlapping expressions of militarist history. You know, one of the most famous versions of this is the ones that fled to Montenegro. It's eventually they become so successful in Montenegro that they form a little proto-state that is like in this antagonistic relationship with the Ottomans and have the most sort of independence or proto-independence for their time. And this is like a very deep set thing that happens in the Serbian Renaissance. During the Renaissance, when people are like learning to read and write and start printing newspapers for the first time and printing stories and leaflets and publishing books and codifying languages, this is all like precursors to the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment sort of, when you want people to buy a book, you gotta fill the book with stories that they might know. So all of these like poetry and cultural signifiers of what it meant to be a Serb or a person from the Balkans enter their way into literature, and that literature draws heavily on the stories of the Haiduks. And the Haiduks become these like super romanticized bandits. They become Robin Hood figures. There's like poems written about them and stories and all these things about like these heroic, steal from the rich kind of people. And it's really easy to get like caught up in that and to form a tribe and sort of say, well, you know, we're fighting against injustice and therefore we can't be capable of injustice ourselves, which is one of those things that is sort of very human nature. We tend to think like when there's things that we like, it's very hard for us to like, once we've decided we like somebody or dislike somebody, for example, it's very hard to like let go of that and to change your mind. We like to sort of view the world in simplistic ways, and a lot of the time these like Haiduks are so romanticized because they're seen as these like proto-independent freedom fighters. There's no general evidence to suggest that that's ever what they were, but that's certainly what they became, because as the Habsburgs moved south and started fighting against the Ottomans, they reached out to the Haiduks and they said, "Come fight for us." Same with the like Hussars. So like in the sort of flatter, more open parts of northern Serbia, along those border regions, you get these like independent sort of horse breeding industries, but like economies that started breeding horses and training warriors, and they're also like used for raiding and scouting and that sort of thing. These traditions sort of go hand in hand. And it's very easy to sort of look back on these like beautiful, gorgeous, romantic paintings of Haiduks and frontiersmen and hussars and that sort of thing, and sort of see them as this like glorious, forgotten past that you need to live up to. And that's essentially what happens, because if you had to boil it all down to one thing, you would say like it's the Turks. You know, the Turks did this by conquering this whole area, but the Turks, it's like the Turks don't exist in a vacuum. The Turks are only the enemy that you can sort of make them out to be. You know, it's very easy to say, okay, well, the Turks came in and they burned down our village. Okay, yeah, that's like an injustice that you can latch onto. But if it's sort of ties into something deeper about like having to have a rebirth, and we need to like conquer and prophesy a conquest of our former lands and take down the Turks and take down the infidels, it becomes so much more nefarious. And this is like why all of these literary traditions are so like apocalyptic in describing the Turks. And whenever they describe themselves and their heroic deeds, it's always like these heroic undertones of like glorious battle and martyrdom and self-sacrifice. And that is, in essence, what is the origin of Balkan militarism. I mean, we haven't even talked about Bulgaria. You know, like this is only sort of focusing on sort of the northern central region of the Balkans. We haven't even talked about Albania. We haven't talked about Greece. These are all like competing things that are happening, all because the geography has such a big effect on these people. And then these maps are sort of very useful in like looking at demographics. Whenever you look at demographic changes in the Balkans that have happened over time, they're really reflective of how that happened in the first place. So I have here some of the most interesting maps are the ones that like lie to you. You know, you've got the world. You've got, nowadays we have like a Croatia, and we have a Bosnia and Herzegovina, and a Serbia, and a Kosovo, and a Vojvodina, and a Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Albania. These are all like things that exist in our world as like defined nation states. But if you look, the implication being like, Croatia is full of Croats. But for a long time, there was a significant minority of Serbs that were descendants of these people that settled along these frontiers. Same goes for Bosnia. It's this like mixed hodgepodge of people, and a lot of those areas are mixed for that exact reason. Like Vojvodina to this day is like very mixed. Obviously, as time has gone on, people have assimilated more, and people have migrated out to their like to different parts of the world. There were a lot of Hungarians and Germans that migrated out of Vojvodina, especially after the Second World War. But still to this day, like Vojvodina is very culturally and ethnically and linguistically quite mixed. And I love these like maps that you have. So this is sort of the Kingdom of Hungary, which is just the Hungarian part of the Habsburg realms that eventually sort of gets this border drawn around it and sort of gets treated as this separate political entity within the Habsburg realm, sort of on the eve of the Second World War. Look at how many Serbs are in Croatia. This is, all of these dark purple bits are Serbs. This is the borders of what is Croatia. It is an incredibly deeply tied thing to this land. These borders line up very well with the military frontier. So the military frontier sort of was centered on here for a little while, and then it sort of moved south. This is the like Lika and Banal areas. This is contiguous with what we were looking at before. And a lot of these areas were directly descendants of those original colonists that were allowed to stay there and eventually be what we now know as like a Croatian Serb or a Croatian Bosniak or whatever. Look over here at Vojvodina. This is like an incredibly mixed area. This is in 1910, so this is like more than 100 years ago at this point, and it's such an example of how mixed that area was. It is filled to the brim with Hungarians sipping on their goulash. It is filled to the brim with Romanians sipping on their Romanian goulash. It's also filled to the brim with Germans, you know, eating their schnitzels and their sauerkraut. This is an extremely mixed area, but the Serbs make up the majority, and because this ends up being that political and religious center of the Serbs within the Habsburg areas, that is sort of one of those reasons why it sort of becomes part of Serbia in the end. And you know, with more than a little bit of bloodshed along the way. Serbia, as the sort of core part of Serbia, that Moravian Serbia, which is just below, sort of sits over here, doesn't show up on the map. That eventually sort of restores a little bit of independence and becomes the Serbian Principality in this great like revolt against the Ottomans during the Napoleonic Wars, and they eventually receive a modicum of independence with the understanding that over time they'll be able to receive more independence. And many of their compatriots are living across the border in the Habsburg Empire, and that is the origin of this like we need to like unify these lands, and we're looking to these two or three or several different like cultural or militarized traditions that sort of form this core part of what it means to be a militarized kingdom in this early period. All of this was about like conquest and bloodshed. When the Serbian Principality achieved like its modicum of independence, the first thing they did was start to like harass Muslims and Turks and Albanians and stuff that like lived within their borders, and then that was like part of their state building thing. And then it was like, okay, now we need to move south and conquer more people and conquer more territory and take things with guns. We need to go shoot people and take their lands and burn down their villages the same way which was done to us, at least in the romantic retelling of the stories. And that is just this like incredibly sad and destructive force that has happened. You know, these areas so like poor and economically disadvantaged because of these like incredibly destructive wars. And one of the reasons why the Yugoslav project in itself gets started is because you have tons of these like Serbs living in Croatia and being a very important representative part of that section. So when all of these Croatian bros get together and they decide we're gonna pursue making a Croatia one day, we're all gonna be Croats. Serbs living within their area are part of those conversations and having an effect on those conversations and those negotiations. It's all part of the same. It's all part of the same cosmic soup of goulash that is happening in the Balkans. And when they all sort of realize that they're all pursuing the same thing, that is how a Yugoslavia is born. And when the Yugoslavs all get together and they say, okay, we're all kind of related, we're all kind of together, and we're all kind of the same people. Yeah, we've got some differences here and there, but let's unify in the pursuit of a nation state in opposition to imperialism. Imperialism really gone out of fashion. Imperialism is this crazy. You gotta make a little imperial edict when you're in imperialism. When you're doing an imperialism, you gotta throw out the imperial edict and you gotta translate it into all these languages. Look at this. You got Hungarian, you got German, you got Croatian, you've got Slovak. It's too many languages. It's too hard to do imperialism. We gotta get back to anti-imperialism, and that's what nationalism is. And nationalism takes its first little baby steps out into the world as being this anti-imperialist force. And who would have thought that one day those little baby step nationalists would grow up and cause a couple of world wars? It's crazy. You never expect it. But, I blame the parents. And these parts up here are some of the most interesting parts to me as well. You can see these like tiny little dots of pink sort of sprinkled in along like this, like these little islands of pink sprinkled in here, this like sea of German gray, which is what I call the weather in Germany. So the sea of German gray, and then these tiny little pink dots, those are all Croats. And this is directly tied in to that map we were looking before when these migrations had taken place. When the Croats were originally migrating to this part of the world, when they first got brought into the Habsburg realms, right over there you can see Varagin front. That there is one of the first areas that the Croats migrated into. Obviously, there were a lot of Croats. Oh, sorry, the Drava front. This is where the Croats and the Croats, Slovenes, and Slavonians lived, and a lot of them migrated to get away and settled along here, this area called the Drava front. That roughly today is what is now this part of Austria. So eventually this all collapses. This area all collapses and becomes part of Austria to this day. This is like the most eastern part of Austria, and this is a state or like county or something called like Burgenland. I don't know what that means. And to this day, there's tons of Croatian speakers that speak like a dialect of Croatian that is very old and has its origins during these migrations, which is like super duper fascinating. These are very real remnants of these military frontiers, very real and like tangible remnants of these of those military frontiers and these massive migrations and settling all these people along these frontiers in order to fight people. And there's like place names that are associated with these things. In the nation building experiments, a lot of names, like place names, have changed over time, and like people will reverse names to try and conform to whatever the dominant language is. So if you've got a bunch of towns that are like named Serbian or Croatian in Hungary, and then eventually the Hungarian nation state happens and you have World War I and World War II, when those nation building states start to like reverse that, they'll like come up with a Hungarian name for that town or city or whatever. But if you look at the older names for a lot of these settlements, they are Croatian in origin or Hungarian in origin, depending on wherever you happen to be at the time. Marco Grick says the migrations of people are not just violent nowadays. A lot of Hungarians are leaving Serbia because Hungary renationalized them, giving them easy access to EU. I don't know what you're saying, but yes, like this is like there are non-violent forms of like causing migrations. Absolutely, yes. Like there's like economic ways and there are political ways. It's not just like at the end of a spear or at the end of a gun nozzle or whatever. But a lot of the times it is. And especially when you're like looking back to like past migrations as unjust. So that's something like, in Croatian nationalism that sort of festers during the Second World War. They viewed they viewed Serbs as like immigrants, even though they'd been there for centuries. They sort of looked at the past migration as an injustice, even though it's not like they invaded and took over their land. It's not the same as that. But it's sort of when you're trying to rise people up and get them to fight against other people, you have to sort of look back on these migrations as like injustices, or doing a migration is a justice, that kind of thing. And these migrations, a lot of the time, it's like done economically. The Ottomans, for example, they were very fond of like planting people who were like very loyal to them into places that weren't loyal to them. So that's one of the reasons why there are so many Muslims in the Balkans. They were religiously cohabiting with the Ottomans and the Ottoman dynasty. So it was like much less likely that they would rebel. So they would get planted in these like deserted villages, and they would either pressure those people to go and move there, or they would do them by choice, depending on whatever the case may be. And that also has like these massive effects over time, because you're changing the demographic makeup of these people. The Balkans have always been extremely mixed, and it's nation building that aims to like demix. And it's not just the Balkans, obviously. Everywhere's like mixed, but it's one of those things where the nation building project has like left such like blood in its path, just because if you can't make people change or leave accordingly, then you do a war crime, or you do a little bad, you do a little genocide. It's a tale as old as time, and nowadays we call it. We know that the cause is nationalism, or different kinds of nationalism. We like different. There's like religious nationalism, and there's like ethnic nationalism or linguistic nationalism. But it's all cut from the same cloth. It's all about like us and them, tribalism. A tale as old as time. Look at all these Hungarians just like darting themselves like little islands in and around what is now Romania. Up in here, there's a giant chunk of Hungarians. Over here they're like separated, but there's a bunch of Hungarians living in here. So what the when you're building a Hungary, and you don't want to be like this mixed Hungary anymore, and you're a Hungarian nationalist, where are you going to draw the borders? This is a big problem. We got to get the Hungarians in. We got to get the other peoples out. But how do you unify these two completely separate areas? How do you do that? That's a massive problem. That's a massive challenge if you're a nationalist, if you're trying to claim that these sorts of things shouldn't exist and that people shouldn't mix. If you're a nationalist, this is a big problem for you. And of course, we know how many hilarious attempts are made to join these two pieces in the interwar period and like World War II, the rise of fascism. One of my favorite maps is always drawing this like Hungarian fascist state that sort of ends up becoming this ally of Nazi Germany, and becomes part of the tripartite pact and all that kind of stuff. They sort of draw their borders, and Hitler comes into the negotiation and he says, okay, we're going to make a nice big Hungary. We're going to draw all the borders around all the Hungarians. And then right over here, we're going to just cut off a giant chunk of Romania. And then we're going to take all these little Hungarians living in the mountains over here, and we're going to chunk it right back over here. And we're going to join it all together. And we're not going to worry too much about all the Romanians living in the countryside and that who aren't Hungarians and don't speak Hungarian and all that kind of stuff. It's one of those like really funny maps because it ends up just being this like, oh, it's Hungary and Hungary's tail just over here, which I always thought was quite funny. I always find these things extremely fascinating, and if you look at maps and if you stare at maps as long as I do, you have a longing for maps. You just want to stare at them for a little while. They really can tell an incredible story, as you well know if you're a fan of the Suibhne channel. I spend far too long looking at maps, enjoying maps. Look at these maps. These are all sort of grouped together. All these like blue bits are sort of grouped together. People that the Ottomans felt were necessarily related or related enough that they could be grouped together. These light blue parts, these are all Serbs. We can group all the Serbs together. Look how many of the Serbs are living over here in the Habsburg Empire. This is the border here. This is the mighty Danube. There's Belgrade. And look at all these Serbs living over here. This is the core of the original Serbian kingdom. It's much further south. So this core here, this Moravian Serbia, that's like this like Serbian core that extends all the way down here to the coast. These coastal principalities, they're extremely old Serbian principalities, right down here into northern Albania, right down here into Kosovo, down into North Macedonia. Huge populations of like Orthodox Serbs that are living there. These maps are like helpful in showing how the great migrations have happened, because all of these Serbs here, these are migrating Serbs that like moved along to become part of the Habsburg frontier, same as these ones up here. This are all of these Habsburg military frontiers sort of snake their way along the outside here. And then when Croatia comes along and says we want to group all the Croats together, that's another big problem, because you got all these Croatians living in and amongst here and in Bosnia and down here in Herzegovina and here in Dalmatia. We're going to draw the biggest line we can around the most of our people and exclude those that we don't want in our Croatia. And we're going to kick all the Serbs out, kick all the Muslims out. And it's just that tale is as old as time. looking back on the Haiduks, inventing stories and inventing literature to sort of say, no, we're justified and we're right in doing this. We're just taking back what is originally ours, that kind of thing. It's all just made up crap. Another one that I thought was interesting. I do love this map purely because like this sort of like purple area here. This in Serbian like historiography, they call this like old Serbia. You can see that most of the chunk of what is being shown here. This is Kosovo right here, and up here this is Novi Pazar. So these two areas are shown to be on this key. It's quite a funny key because it's like we've got Muslim Serbian in the key. So we've got like, okay, Muslim Serbian, okay, or Greek Orthodox Serbian, which is just a way of saying Orthodox Serbian. So you got purple is all the Orthodox Serbs, and then you've got Muslim Serbs. So a bunch of what they thought, what they used as a term to describe Serbs who are also Muslim. Very mixed. And then of course you've got Albanians, and then you got these like Catholic Albanians, which is, you know, Catholicism had a deep root in Albania, and then you got Islam, Muslim Albanians sort of sprinkled in there. Look at how mixed this area is prior to the Serb expansion. So when the Serbs come along and they conquer old Serbia, which is like this like the core of their like medieval state, which they believe that they're like religiously prophesied to rebirth. They take over this area and then they go, okay, well, we got to get all the people out that don't fit the box. We got to kick out as many of the Albanians and the Muslims and the whomever else like doesn't fit the prototypical version of like an Orthodox Serb. Yeah, these maps are all like quite interesting. So we're gonna leave it there for today. This has been a lot of fun. Perhaps went a little bit longer than I was expecting to. It's a very late day here at Suibhne HQ. We've done too much. We've done too much looking at maps. We've gone down too many rabbit holes. And I think I've looked at enough rabbit holes. And the weekend is coming along. We're gonna decide. We're gonna go out to a nice medieval or early modern fort, a bastion fort, and go and look at it and stand and look at it in awe, knowing that it can stop a cannonball. Ain't no cannonball gonna be getting into that star fort.